Hello, welcome. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. This is part 2 of a sort of general series of what is happening right now in the world. Like, what is happening? What's up? There's a lot. There's a lot that's up. Everything's happening. There's still a war in Russia. I'm not talking about that today. There's midterm elections coming up. I talked about that in the last part. And there's a lot of stuff going on with the Supreme Court right now on their shadow docket, which is quickly becoming an annoying feature of this new generation of Supreme Court, where important decisions are made behind closed doors in a very annoying and direct way that, ugh. I mean, I get it. I see it. I see the reason for it. I just don't like the way it's being used right now. I mean, historically, it's not been used in the same way, but we'll talk about it. We'll get into it. So yeah, thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll hang out because I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, you heard the shadow docket and some of the cases that are up in the shadow docket right now. And I'm also going to share one of my favorite stories with you. It's a sad story. It's a funny story. It's a very American story about one of my favorite websites that had to die. It was called Gawker. I'm going to tell you about it. It's relevant. It doesn't sound like it is, but it is. Stick around. The Supreme Court Shadow Docket sounds so stealthy and, I don't know, like clandestine. It's not. I mean, it's not intended to be. It's essentially like the cases that go up to the Supreme Court actually kind of fall into a couple different categories, one of which is the merit cases. And those are ones where you get to hear oral arguments and that there are, judgments and dissents and, the normal shit. And then there's the shadow docket, which is basically cases that come before the court that they're basically being requested to go up for merit, but they, for whatever reason, the court decides not to take it up for merit. But there is some kind of an action that is taken, or a confirmation of an action or an inaction by the court. We'll talk about that a little bit more. That's been the Texas abortion law that preceded the overturning of Roe was a decision that happened on the shadow docket. And essentially what it was is it Texas came up with this really wacky law, with their abortion ban. It was like a 6-week abortion ban or something crazy. I don't remember. It doesn't matter now. I mean, it does, but it still hurts. In any event, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was like, no, and we're not going to hear this case, but we're not going to get involved. Texas can go ahead with their law. So they did. And it blew the doors off the barn. And then, then we saw the leak of the Supreme Court decision of the overturning on Roe. And then in the actual Supreme Court season, they announced it in the decision on Dobbs. So the shadow docket, it's becoming a tool. It's becoming a kind of yucky mechanism by which the legal system can be leveraged to either reinforce bad decisions that have been made in lower courts, or not correct them, or something along those lines. It's very lawyerly, it's very litigious, and it's very exclusive. It doesn't involve a lot of representative input, from people representing. It's just a really, I think you get it. Google it if you want to learn more about the shadow docket. I don't necessarily want to. I'm not a scholar and I'm not a lawyer, so it's kind of unfair for me to sit here and the shadow docket, it's stupid, But that's how I feel. It's not stupid. There's a good reason for it to be there. It's just that I don't feel like its current use is being It's like they're not, obeying the spirit of the law. They're obeying the letter of the law. But the spirit of the law, they're like, fuck you. And by they, I definitely mean conservative activists. I don't think that liberal activists have found their opportunity yet, but they would use it if they could. They will. It's coming. They're just usually late on this kind of stuff, but they will. So a couple of the really interesting cases that are up. One is Moore v. Harper, and the other is the Students for Fair Admission versus UNC. Like those two cases are on the docket, and both of them are keyed up for like some pretty significant things. So first, I want to talk about Moore v. Harper. This is a case about redistricting, and it's a little bit bananas. And I mean, as everything is right now, like in the legal system, there's a lot of like pushing the envelope and sort of like strained, legal interpretations. So historically, we've always kind of been like, poo poo, like it'll never fly in the courts. But, the courts are very different right now. Like there's a lot of conservative activism on the courts right now. Yeah, I said it. There's actual conservative activism happening on the courts right now, up to and including the Supreme Court, but not exclusive to the Supreme Court. The situation recently with the former president and the judge overseeing the case relating to his stealing of hundreds of classified documents is an excellent example of that. Because that decision too was like a freaking bonkers, but there it was. And it's still, lots of her decisions still stand in spite of like the special master involvement and blah, 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 blah. But the good news is the Justice Department has actually been able to do some work with the documents. So they were at least unable to, what is the word I'm looking for? They were unable to obstruct the process of the Justice Department's investigation, but they were very successful in leveraging litigious delays, which was very much the, I think, main point, and is typically the point of most of Trump's legal strategies is just delay because he's a criminal, but a rich criminal. So he's in a different class of criminal. Anywho, Moore v. Harper. So here's the basic argument in Moore v. Harper. So there was this insane gerrymandered map that the Republican-led legislature kind of put out there. And the liberal opposition obviously was like, no. And they took it to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court was like, right? No, that's stupid. Like that map is obviously not, like it makes no sense. Like you can't use that map. They then took it to the Supreme Court. And the argument now that the Republicans on that legislature are making, they point to language in the Constitution that identifies what they call the independent state doctrine. So they put doctrine on it. It's really important. It's doctrine. Ooh, it's a doctrine, but it's not. It's, I guess, more properly referred to as the independent state legislatures theory, which argues that state legislatures have exclusive authority over and above any other state entity over federal elections. That is what it boils down to, which is obviously like ridiculous on its face. Like it's ridiculous that the state legislature would just sort of it's not dissimilar from saying that the vice president has like unilateral authority to return electors, right? In a federal presidential race like that. It's as ludicrous that's the argument. And again, the courts are not necessarily predictable in that. I mean, they refuse to hear any cases that might have involved that on the federal side, like with the presidential race, but they are actually responding to this case. In what they've essentially said is that the map that the liberal opposition, set forth as a revised, like more sort of equitable map must be used for the 2020 election. But after that, all bets are off. And they can, and so the argument, kind of then continues. And like the Texas legislature maneuver, then it leaves a doorway open for another kind of like attack that then destabilizes that whole idea and puts state legislatures and or secretaries of state kind of in the driver's seat on elections, so that if you have an election denier in that seat who's like doesn't like the results, then they're like, oh, but I have the power to change it legally. Like what? That's kooky. That is kooky. It's just obviously wrong, right? I mean, right? It's obviously wrong. But it's not to the court right now. There are two other cases actually out there on redistricting. One in Alabama, one in Louisiana, and they all are kind of referencing some similar types of legislative acrobatics. And so, again, that's like three separate cases that are involved here. Yikes! That's how Roe fell. It's disheartening. I think it's disheartening to me. I feel like the use of the courts as a political instrument isn't new. Okay, right? Like again, it's not like Democrats haven't done their fair share of like court acrobatics, again, for lack of a better way of describing it. But there we go again with our hypocrisy as we cling to the idea that our courts sort of transcend the political messiness of us mere mortals, which is just quite obviously untrue. As I think much of my pod is kind of like demonstrated. I talk about the courts a lot because the Supreme Court decisions ultimately are, what impact the legislative landscapes of our lives and therefore the daily like living of our lives. The courts are as much a political instrument as a legislative body or an executive leader. It can't ascend above its humanity, and it will inevitably reflect a certain cultural zeitgeist at various moments in time. Bad court decisions happen just like good court decisions happen. Plessy v. Ferguson is an excellent example of a bad court decision that really affected the future of millions of Americans. Millions of American citizens were marginalized by that decision in painful ways. And they weren't even, technically considered citizens at that time. But I think by virtue of their existence, they should have been able to claim it. It's my view. So like morally, right? On a basic human level, they were citizens. They were people born in this country, affected by everything that the country does, everything the government did. And they were abused and, oppressed and, horrifically and savagely brutalized for hundreds of years. It's hard to think about, right? Like it's hard to when really process those things in a visceral way, like when you really start to like think about it in a specific way with that kind of specificity. And I think that's probably why we tend not to do it. We don't like to think about things that make us feel bad. We avoid it. That's not a bad instinct. It's not. I don't blame anybody for that, but doing that at the risk of ignoring fundamental facts or realities that have a genuine consequence. I then have to kind of be like, just grin and bear it. Like, get in there. You got to do it. Just get on with it. You can't deny it. You can't just say, no, that didn't happen, because it did. And you can't just denying it just delays the inevitable. So just like rip that Band-Aid off. Just like get on with it. Admit the thing you don't want to admit. And then let's figure out how it works. It doesn't mean surrender. It doesn't mean that you have to give up everything you believe in. Admitting something that's true means that you're being courageous enough to say, I don't like it, but this is what happened. And here's how I'd like to fix it. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. So next, I am going to talk a little bit about my favorite story, my favorite recent like American story that involves courts and the media. And boy, it's a banger, man. It's a really interesting story, and I hope that you will be as entertained and as stirred by it as I am. Before I do that, though, I do just want to say like a brief comment about the Supreme Court as a kind of a general note, which is that in 1869 the Supreme Court was modified to include 9 justices, and at that time the population of the United States was 39 million people. That was from the 1870 census. It was 39 million people approximately. And boy, the population of the United States now is something closer to 327 million. The racial demographics of the country, the economic demographics of voters in this country, it's very different than it was in 1870. So for people who have a panicky response to the idea of expanding the court to be somewhat more representative of the country, you know, that's an interesting statistic to hold in your mind. 39 million versus 327 million. 9 people making decisions about 39 million people's lives, 9 people making decisions about 327 million people's lives. Like the math doesn't add up there to me. You know, the Nuremberg trials had more justices than, you know, The Hague has more justices than this. Like it's, you know, a step up, right? To recognize that though the court is not seen as a political body, okay, like it is, and B, it is also a representative body. It's intended to be a representative body. There is no representation on this court that can speak to the diversity of the United States right now, both economically, politically, and racially. Like it just the court does not represent the country right now. It just doesn't. And it should, shouldn't it? I think we can all agree on that. So, don't close your mind to the idea of modifying the Supreme Court to be a better body, to be a more representative body, to be a body that allows for a true, and diverse and inclusive interpretation of our Constitution. That seems fair to me. I don't see how anybody can argue with that. I mean, everybody will argue with that. I have this feeling, but I feel your arguments will fail. I'm just saying. All right. So coming up, Gawker, hang out. It's going to be super fun. Around the 90s and early aughts, there was a website that I really loved. It was called Gawker, and they were, oh boy, just a bunch of bitchy dorks. They kind of thumbed their nose at, mainstream media, and the sort of lack of privilege acknowledgement. They really were, just doggedly annoying. And, Gawker was at the vanguard of accountability culture. They were for sure the precursor for cancel culture. I mean, like, there's no doubt in my mind that Gawker, kind of led the charge on that. They had a suite of really great sites, actually. Jalopnik was one that they did on like auto stuff. Jezebel was like a feminist related site. They had oh man, I'm not going to be able to remember them now, but they're great. They were great. They were a really great site. But they were, this Gawker in particular almost had like a page 6 vibe to it. Like it was very like newsy gossip, like less about like the society pages than it was about like people in power, like people with influence, both, in business and in politics. And they were kind of annoyingly and again, like doggedly, calling out authority figures are powerful people for their shitty deeds in the bitchiest way possible. I mean, they were very irreverent in their tone. They did not care that they seemed sort of tacky and gauche. They just were like, yeah, okay, cool. But, rich people get away with stupid and, horrible things, and they shouldn't have to, we should be holding them accountable for that. They shouldn't just be able to get away with it because everybody's like, shh, we don't talk about that. Like, oh, media has a liberal bias. Here's a video of Toronto Mayor Rob Ford buying and smoking crack. Oh, don't fuck with Scientology lest ye be destroyed. Fuck you. Here's a whole supercut of Tom Cruise's craziest bullshit. Like, they were savage. They were super savage. They were bitchy and self-righteous and just deliciously petty. And I would argue that they really didn't carry a ton of media credibility at the time, though they did actually do some pretty legitimate investigative reporting. But they weren't like a significant threat in terms of like shaping mainstream consciousness in the way that like CNS or Fox or, an NBC network does. They were just kind of this annoying like fly in the ointment. But at one point in time, one of their reporters did a piece, and he might have even been an editor. And he's the editor is he's gay. He was out gay at the time. And again, this is sort of like late 90s, like late 90s ish, I think, that he does this. He writes an editorial basically outing Peter Thiel, who is a Silicon Valley, venture capitalist, and is a really, really strange and apparently like deeply vindictive guy. And, he's kind of a weirdo. And so the editorial guy was kind of, he didn't like be like, hey, I know that Peter Thiel is gay. Like but the editorial is basically like, it was presumed that Peter Thiel was gay. And here are all the reasons that that's great representation in Silicon Valley. But Peter Thiel had never like admitted to be gay. He, in fact, I think vehemently denied it. And so, again, it was bitchy. Like it was just a really bitchy tone. And, I think meant more or less satirically, but that's not at all how it read. And that's certainly not how Peter Thiel took it. And they really didn't let up on him in that way. They were just like, all right, cool. Like you say you're not gay, but there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. Like we got this, we got that, we got this. Like there was that, kind of like vibe in play, which is, kind of gross on the part of Gawker. I mean, but again, I admit it. I kind of love them for that. I love it. I think that, it's the high road is all well and good, but it's an illusion, and it is not a I just don't find it like realistic at all that aspirational, like, will all always be noble in every endeavor is like a thing that is healthy. It's not. I mean, I'm not saying we should aim for evil, but we should aim for balance, and we should acknowledge, we should acknowledge the pettiness in our lives, so that, we should acknowledge those feelings of anger so that we can confront them and understand them and better deal with them. But what Peter Thiel did was to bankroll the craziest lawsuit that has happened in the last century, in my opinion, which was Hulk Hogan and Bubba the Love Sponge, who were best pals. Bubba had been sleeping with Hulk Hogan's wife, according to Bubba, with his full knowledge. Like it was not unlike a sort of like friendly swingers situation. And there were videotapes. And Hulk Hogan claims, first of all, that he had no idea about any of this, and he was hurt and he was heartbroken. But then, moreover, that tape got leaked and Gawker had it, and Hulk Hogan sued them, and Hulk Hogan was bankrolled by Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel, as aforementioned, Silicon Valley venture capitalist, he's a billionaire. Peter Thiel has a lot of money, and he used a lot of money. He was delighted to divert a huge amount of money to bring Gawker down. And essentially he did. He bankrupted them with legal fees and destroyed their platform, and they had to sell. And they're still kind of out there, but they're no fun anymore. It's not the Gawker that it was. They lost their identity, and Peter Thiel killed it. And hey, one could argue that that's a free market, right? Like result. That's a consequence of, action in the free market, of free speech, right? Like Peter Thiel used his money and privilege and power to reinforce his First Amendment preferences. And though Gawker was ultimately not found guilty of any kind of like legal defamation or like slander or libel or anything like that, they just had to go out of business because they couldn't afford to survive anymore, because it went on and on and on and on. And why I find this court case so terrifically amusing is because obviously it's about two of the most like flamboyant and kind of like demonstrably, quote unquote macho wrestlers, Hulk Hogan and Bubba the Love Sponge. Like that's silly. It's silly. And the conversation that I can't actually ever remember his name. I think he's a Terry. Hulk Hogan, his actual identity, like his personal identity is a Terry. And throughout his testimony throughout the trial, the way that he characterized the character of Hulk Hogan versus the person, of Terry, it was so strange, and it sounded a lot like dissociative identity disorder. Like when Hulk Hogan comes, out, it's, X, Y, and Z. And so I can't be held responsible. Like I can talk about the size of Hulk Hogan's dick all day long on Howard Stern's show. And, that's really not, a problem. But, I'm not talking about Terry's dick. You shouldn't even be thinking about Terry's dick. Like Terry's dick is not at issue here. Well, who are you right now? Well, I'm Hulk Hogan. Well, let's talk about your dick. Okay. Hold on. Like it's just really strange. It's really strange. And yet, Gawker had to pay some shit as a result of this. I mean, it's a funhouse mirror, just like reflecting Americans back to themselves in this one for me. It's very emblematic of how Americans like function. We love the story because it's lurid, right? A sex tape with Bubba the Love Sponge. And then it turns out it's like the ultimate betrayal of like a best friend. And like, but then it's like a he said, she said thing. Like, Bubba says Terry knew, and Terry's like, nah. It's just got all the drama. It's all, all so lurid and lascivious and, prurient. It's got all the stuff, but then it also has this like underbelly, this very dark and cynical political exercise to use the courts to punish a rival in business. And it just so happens that rival is a publisher. And so it, shut down an alley of speech. They legitimately did. I mean, it's, they were silenced. Gawker was silenced. I mean, they had to sell, so you can make the argument, they still exist. But they don't. Like, they're totally different. If you look at any one of the individual sites, it's totally different. So that's how America makes its will known. We have our culture wars, and then we have our court battles. And they're very, very connected. And we love, again, to sort of like think of our court system as sort of like flying above it all. But I think the reality is coming more clear and into focus, that the courts are as much a political mechanism as Congress. It's just that it is a longer game and it requires a different strategy. And over the last, 3 decades, the Republicans in Congress and in the White House, but somewhat to a lesser extent, but the Republicans in Congress have had a very laser focus on political infrastructure victories, such as court appointments. And that is now we're seeing the consequences of that, again, pro-choice activists and liberal activists and, voting rights activists have been, freaking out about for the last many years. We're beginning to see, how those choices are affecting people's lives. But again, that's not the end of the world, right? Like we've been, steps backwards do happen. Again, the American people are a fickle lot, and we're a great big country, and there's a whole bunch of us, and there's an enormous array of diversity therein. And so, it's really hard to govern a body like that. Let's just all acknowledge that it's hard, and especially in a democratic way, right? Like where everybody gets a voice and we're all just like a bunch of bitches that are like, well, what about me? So, and then so we're all like making choices through these like limited, very narrow lenses. And it's very easy to do that as our lives become busier and scarier, or feel less safe, or we feel economically pressured, right? It becomes much, much simpler to make decisions based on those elements versus, zooming out into the big picture of like, small d democracy at risk. I mean, that's a bummer. Does anybody legitimately want to be thinking about that? I would argue no. All right. That's this bit. And the next bit, I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple of the cases that are up on the shadow docket right now. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this part. In the next part, I will be talking about a couple of cases relating to affirmative action. And I don't think we've heard a lot of chitter chatter about affirmative action sort of in mainstream society for a while, but here we are. So I'm going to dive into that a little bit. And that also relates to some stuff on immigration that I've been thinking about as it relates to that case. So the two don't seem like they should be related, but they kind of are in my mind, and I'll explain why. So thank you again, and I hope you'll return for the next part. If you want to give me any feedback or ask questions, make recommendations, or maybe you want to cuss at me a little bit, I'd prefer you not. But if you feel like you have to, you can do it. And you can reach me through email at Susie Makes a Podcast, SUZI makes a podcast at gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at Susie Makes a Podcast. Until next time.